What's up guys, Jay here back in the video. Today's video is what if Dakota and Beth swap seasons. This video was by Dylan B4403. I got a bunch of character suggestions from like Gen 1 and Gen 2, and let's begin. So Dakota gets put and see how Island and Revenge play out. So first of all, Dakota wouldn't jump to get her hair wet, but she would actually bump Lindsay in the first episode. Her introduction is the same as Revenge at the Island. To be honest, nothing will change with Katie and Izzy still swapping teams, and Killer Bass still lose since Dakota wouldn't affect the challenge. Ezekiel still says his comment and he gets voted off. Again, episode 3. Now, Heather still stays as a free player. However, in this episode, Heather makes 2 alliances. Herself, she'd obviously convince Lindsay, but now that Beth's not here, I had to think about this for a while and who she'd convince. And there were 4 people I thought of. Was Owen, Noah, Izzy, and Justin. And I'll explain why Dakota does not join. And Cody is obsessed with Gwen, and he has been shown to be pretty smart, and surprisingly can see through manipulation very well. Trent is the same, and Lashana and Gwen, so they're out of the equation. I do have a what-if scenario of Gwen and Lashana joining Heather's group, which will be interesting. Dakota is too popular and wouldn't like Heather, so I don't think she'd join her, even though you could argue she's a good asset. She prefers being famous and wouldn't really care about Heather's manipulation tactics. Owen, it's very unlikely since he doesn't really like Heather, and I don't think he'd work very well because he would just reveal her alliance. Izzy is kind of the same, however, in the merge it was working together, but that was more kind of Izzy just doesn't really work, and Noah could work, but I actually think Justin works pretty well. Because the big reason I think Justin works well for Heather's alliance is Justin can manipulate people and use his looks, so Heather can gain more allies on her side, which is something Heather didn't account for. Yes, Justin is a threat, and Justin's one of the few people that can properly challenge Heather, but at this point, Justin wouldn't really be thinking of that. So Heather would want to get rid of Dakota as quick as possible, and ultimately actually aligns herself with Justin. He does accept this as well. So in episode 3, Heather still stays young free player. Dakota would do terrible in this challenge, and to be honest, Eva still gets voted off. An episode is dodgeball, and Noah refuses / doesn't compete. Dakota does terrible in the challenge, but she at least competes for a round. Duncan and Harold still win the challenge for their team, and Noah gets voted off for being a smartass. Episode 5 is the talent show. Now, this episode is going to be very different to the original. So, first of all, Duncan, DJ, Courtney, and Bridget with her Jeff breaking a skateboard. Harold still wins the challenge, and Heather still reads Gwen's diary. Big thing here, Heather doesn't get rid of Justin because Justin's her ally. And Heather gains nothing by getting rid of Justin at this point, so at this point in the season, she doesn't target Justin. Instead, Trent still volunteers for the challenge. Although Dakota could be good, I don't think she'd have a natural talent, so I don't think she'd really put herself forward. Instead, Heather would get everyone to target Trent in this timeline, so Justin would use his looks by getting Owen and Izzy on her side, as well as Dakota, with Trent, Gwen, Lashana, and Cody voting for Heather. So Trent would be eliminated. I think this is more realistic since Justin can easily use his looks on Dakota and Owen, who Dakota would be seen with Justin as quite a fashionable person. In Island, his looks worked on Izzy, so I have no problem with this, and they can easily convince her. And even if she didn't vote for Heather, Cody would still vote for Trent anyways by default, so you could argue that Heather can convince Cody. So Trent is eliminated. Which in the original, it was a riskier play getting rid of Justin, which Heather could have still got rid of Justin later on, but it was a much riskier play not getting rid of Trent here, which weakens Gwen as an ally. Now in episode 6 is Sucky Outdoors, Gwen would just be upset that she lost Trent. Justin in this episode is going to notice he can use his looks and starts thinking of rebelling against Heather. However, Heather still has Lindsay and Justin, and Justin starts acting dumb and thinking that Heather can outplay him. Ultimately, in this episode, Katie and Sadie still get lost, and Dakota would still be fashionable or famous by the other villains. Heather's next plan would be to get rid of Dakota, since she would be the biggest threat to her game, since she could win a popularity contest. So, in this episode, Katie and Sadie still get lost, and ultimately Katie gets voted off because of it. Okay, so now we have some actual changes when we get to Phobia Factor. First off, Duncan passes his sphere like the original, with DJ passing and Sadie. Lindsay would pass bad haircuts, and I think Dakota's would just be the same. And with encouragement from Lindsay, who she would have befriended and start becoming genuine friends, I do think Dakota passes her fear. Owen and Izzy both pass. Heather passes the sumo wrestler. Cody fails the time bomb. Gwen passes. Shauna fails. Now Justin's looking ugly, and he'd actually failed this challenge. Duncan passes. DJ passes. City pass. Harold fails. Bridget fails. Jeff, Tyler fails, and Courtney. Killer Bass still lose because they have 3 to 6 points, and Tyler still gets screwed over, like the original. In episode 8 is Up the Creek, and to be honest, the pairs don't change with Jeff and Courtney and Bridget, Jeff and DJ, Duncan, Sadie, and Harold. Heather would start making moves to try and get her allies in different boats so she can have more people on her side. Here, Gwen still goes in a boat with Cody since she wouldn't want to separate Gwen and Trent. However, I still think Cody would likely want to travel with Gwen since he would start trying to making moves with her, if not even more so, since Trent's not present. Izzy still goes with Shauna. However, Justin actually goes in a boat with Owen since they're friends, which leaves Dakota and Lindsay in a boat with Heather. Heather would get really annoyed with Dakota, but Lindsay would actually start bonding with her. I actually think she's great. Heather would have a confessional wanting to get rid of Dakota as soon as possible. Ultimately, in this episode, doesn't change with Harold's accidentally burn mules. Izzy gives them an idea. Now, who gets voted off after Gopher wins the challenge? Heather convinces her alliance to vote off Dakota. Says although Lindsay likes her, she would have no problem with this, considering the fact in the original she voted for Beth, who's her best friend. Owen is also convinced to vote for Dakota because he can be easily convinced. Cody, Gwen, and Lashana vote for Heather. Izzy votes for Justin, and Dakota probably votes for Heather. So I think Heather, it would be a tiebreak between Heather and I think these 5 vote for Heather. These 4 vote for Heather. These 5 vote for Dakota. Dakota would be going home, except Izzy still gets chased down by the CRM, so she still gets voted off. Now, episode 9 is Paper Day Hunter. Now, there is a big change in this episode, and that is Justin would not Beth without Beth here. She doesn't rebel against the Alliance. Also, a big thing here is nobody took the Tiki statue since Beth is not here. So what does this mean? Well, Heather's still a deer with Gwen, Cody, and now Justin. Dakota would be a hunter. Bridget, the Killer Bassett would remain the same. Well, because there's no barbecue chips, Cody never gets mauled by a bear. And that's important because Beth doesn't go off to get them and gets angry at Heather and accidentally uses a trial, so Cody gets mauled. He doesn't get mauled in this timeline. So Cody never gets mauled by a bear since Beth is the reason Cody got mauled. And Justin will start thinking of plans how to get rid of Heather. Killer Bass lose. Now, Justin is in a tricky situation since Heather probably wants Justin out for doing so pathetic in the challenge, but needs him as an ally since she's had no real reason to turn on him yet. However, Justin has countered this, and he goes to Owen and Dakota on how they want to get Heather out. So Cody, Gwen, and Lashana want to get rid of Heather. Heather and Lashana. Heather tells Justin to vote Lashana, so these 2 vote for Lashana, because Heather just doesn't like Lashana. But Dakota also votes for Heather, and Owen is convinced to vote for Lashana. Now, Justin can either cause a tiebreaker, or he can vote off Heather. And I generally think he'd rather vote for Heather, considering the fact that she was very bossy in this episode, and she's somebody who was mean to the Alliance, on top of the fact Justin will just have the numbers next time they go to elimination to start convincing people to vote for people. So I think Heather gets eliminated in this episode, which really annoys her, and realize Justin betrayed the Alliance. Episode 10 is the cooking challenge, and to be honest, this will not change as Owen still eats the ribs. However, everyone would actually vote for Owen in this episode since he ate the ribs, and Justin wouldn't have a reason to save him at this point. So I do think in this episode, Owen is eliminated. Episode 11 is Who You Can Trust. So I had to do the random number generator because the pairs were so different now. However, on Killer Bass, it does remain the same. So first off, I'll do the random number generator and explain my pairs. So let's go on to point. First of all, it's the climbing challenge. DJ Duncan wins since Justin would be climbing. And Justin is a much worse climber than Gwen, so that Lindsay can't carry Justin, so they get the point. The second part is the bullfish, and it's between Lashawna and Cody. Jeff and Bridget still win like canon, so I think Lashawna and Cody just did that well here. However, unlike Trent, Lashawna will refuse to eat the fish. The blind is Dakota and Gwen, Courtney and Sadie. However, I think Dakota will win, since I think it will play the same like canon with Sadie, obviously having bad aim. I think Dakota wouldn't be great either, but I do think she would be Gwen doing the shooting instead of Dakota. Next would be Harold and Bridget for the blind trapeze, and would be Gwen and Justin, and Bridget and Harold. Gwen and Justin get that point. The final round is Dakota and Justin against Harold, DJ, and Jeff. DJ would still lose the challenge for Killer Bass, and Sadie still gets voted off like normal. In basics training, nothing really changes except the final round. Dakota would be out early on in the first round, and Justin would probably be out in the obstacle course, refusing to get himself dirty. To be honest, Gopher still win the challenge since Gwen is still here, and Howard breaks the belts against Courtney. And episode 13 is where we have a difference. It's extreme torture, so it's DJ, Jeff, and obviously Duncan's driving Harold, so the Cobas plays the same. The Gophers, it's gonna be a random number generator now since I have a completely different cast. I decided to pull the random number generator, except Lashawna, who was still here for the moose riding, but I'm doing the number generator for fun anyways. So the first part of the challenge is the funny thing about this challenge is Dakota and DJ. DJ would win since Dakota would still do terrible in this challenge, like Trent did. Next up is Lashawna versus Jeff, and Lashawna wins the challenge. She dominates the moose. The flagpole is Duncan driving, Justin skiing, and Harold skiing and the driving. And ultimately, Harold wins the challenge since without Heather's top coming off, there's no reason for Harold to lose. Gophers go elimination. At this point in time, Justin has to consider who he wants to get rid of. However, I think he knows it's a tiebreaker, and he's able to convince Lindsay and Dakota, but is able to convince Lashawna and Gwen. Since Gwen has made up with Cody in this version, and the two are actually friends. However, I think the three of them would realize that Justin, there's a chance they could lose the tiebreaker, so they need to vote for somebody who's very strong. And I think they actually agree to go for Dakota, since out of the three of them, Dakota is, well, not the most physically athletic. They agree that Dakota is a huge threat. She might win a popularity contest. On top of the fact Dakota would lose in just about any tiebreaker, but Lindsay seems to have some more knowledge. Justin would get Lindsay and Dakota to actually vote for Cody, since out of the three, he'd be easiest to beat in a tiebreaker. So Cody and Dakota have to face a tiebreaker here. Now, I don't know what the tiebreaker is because there wasn't a tiebreaker in this original episode. However, I think Cody could just about beat Dakota in any tiebreaker, with the exception of fashion, but even then, it's very expected of me to assume. So I'm going to say the tiebreaker is probably the skiing race, and the last person to cross loses. And I think Cody could actually cross realistically before Dakota. So I do think Dakota gets eliminated in this episode. In episode 14, it wouldn't be guys versus girls. But there's a problem this episode because we have more guys than girls. However, it doesn't actually have an actual bearing to this episode. It's a non-elimination. However, now we're at the merge. And Eva and Izzy still return like normal. Now, in this episode, in episode 15, No Pain No Game, Eva still wins the challenge since I don't think Justin does that well, nor Harold or Cody, who are the only people that were not here in the original. Everyone still targets Eva since although Justin has Lindsay on his side, there's no real reason to target Justin this episode, and Gwen, LaShawna, and Cody start trying to get them out. Now, episode 16 is the Keys Challenge. The only people that weren't here the original were Cody, Harold, Justin, and Lindsay. So I decided to do I decided to do the random number generator. But Justin gains immunity since he's closest to villain in this episode. So I decided to do the random number generator. But I'm going to say Justin gets immunity because he's the closest to villain, and he's the new Heather in this universe. So he's going to get immunity. Ultimately, they go to elimination. Now, to be honest, doesn't feel as guilty. He still feels guilty for finding out Courtney. Duncan, Jeff, and DJ and Bridget actually vote for Harold since they want to get him out of the original. And Duncan wouldn't have that suspicion of it being Justin, so I do think he'd figure out Harold that rigged the votes against Courtney, since in this timeline, Justin's not here, nobody else would have had any benefit doing it. So Gwen, LaShawna, and Cody actually vote off Izzy, since Izzy is a wild card and the only person that's not in their alliance. Justin and Lindsay actually vote for LaShawna. Wasn't Shauna doesn't have immunity in this episode. I think Harold gets eliminated since he does the worst. However, Harold actually sides himself with Cody, Gwen, and LaShawna. He actually votes for Duncan, so these four vote Duncan. These four vote for Harold. And Izzy, Justin, and Lindsay also vote for Harold since Izzy tells everyone that Harold rigged the votes on Courtney. So I think everyone does target Harold in this episode since he did the worst. So I think they agree that Harold has to go here. And episode 17 is hiding me sneaking, to be honest. Duncan doesn't make the guys alliance because there's an even number of guys and girls. Instead, Duncan makes a former Killer Bass alliance, not a former Killer Bass alliance, but his ex-Killer Bass members. And because there's no Owen in this alliance, everyone in this alliance is actually able to keep a secret, so they're able to work together a bit longer. However, LaShawna still wins the challenge, and Justin calls out DJ on the roof as he wins immunity. To be honest, LaShawna, this episode plays a bit differently. Now, Duncan has the guidelines so he kill Bass line, so he wouldn't target Bridget since he's working with her and he doesn't gain anything. So instead, they agree to vote for Izzy since she's the biggest threat, is not immune. So everyone actually targets Izzy here since she's just an easy vote. And Justin's only working with Lindsay, but that's kind of it. He's not really a threat. So they get rid of Izzy. In episode 18 is the bike race, and to be honest, in this episode, there are some differences that I've taken into account. First of all, Jeff doesn't crash and lose the bolts, so he never wipes out in this episode since Bridget is still in the game. DJ and Gwen both wipe out, with everybody else qualifying for the second round. Duncan and Jeff crash into each other, which leaves the final five being LaShawna would cross the finish line in the first round, because even though Izzy's not there for the third episode, I still think LaShawna would crash out in the first round since she doesn't have the agility, meaning these are the final six. Now Jeff and Duncan both wipe out. However, Lindsay's the one I can see crossing the finish line though, because she was really good in the original and would have won had she not been tricked by Heather. Justin would win the challenge as well. Between Bridget and Cody, I do think Bridget would cross before Cody. So due to the really unfair ruling in this episode, Bridget is eliminated. And episode 19 is Hook, Ryan, Screamer. Now, here in this episode, the killer goes off, and here Gwen and Duncan would be given all the survival rules, and it goes a bit like this. Cody will stay with Gwen. LaShawna, it will be Justin and Lindsay who will go in the woods actually. In this episode, Gwen and Duncan both win immunity, and I think Jeff gets called by himself in the bathroom like DJ. LaShawna gets caught, and Justin would actually get caught with Lindsay, but they're not making out, or they're just caught together. I think, to be honest, DJ still gets the worst death like in canon, but for slightly different reasons, since he's just really scared rather than screaming at Heather. In episode 20 is the animal buddies, and to be honest, Justin wins immunity by getting his animal in the cage the fastest. However, in this episode, he talks to Duncan and Jeff since there's a three-person alliance, and initially Duncan would want Justin out, but Justin points out that he's not actually done anything, and he points out that in the final four, who would Gwen and Lashana and Cody pick? Who would Lashana pick between Gwen and Cody and Duncan? At least with him around, he'll always have a bigger target on his back than Duncan. Jeff and Justin unfortunately agree, so they ask Justin who would he want to get rid of. And I think the four would verify Lashana as the biggest threat, because this challenge you don't gain immunity. And in this timeline, Lashana has won most of the challenges, and they might not get another chance to vote her off, so I do think they all vote for Lashana. Gwen, Lashana, and Cody would vote for Justin, so I think Lashana is eliminated. However, Lindsay would never rebel against Justin since he would have no reason to use his looks, since he wouldn't have lost to someone like Cody or he wouldn't to Lindsay, so he would never use his looks. Lindsay, so she's still his ally. In episode 21 is Trial by Triathlon, the only crew we see was Gwen and Jeff, so I decided to do the random number generator to determine Cody, Duncan, Justin, Lindsay, what pairs they would get. I decided to use the number generator because I think it's more interesting to do it this way, since even I don't know the pairs as a result. So, funny enough, I got Cody and Duncan as a pair and Justin and Lindsay. So, in this episode, the eating challenge will be actually Duncan and Cody, since Cody would be feeding Duncan. Duncan won the first part in the original, even though Owen's rebelling against Heather and could have won that challenge. Justin and Lindsay do terrible. I think Gwen does decent, but she's feeding Jeff. Justin would refuse to eat it, so he actually is feeding Lindsay. The second part of the challenge is race to Bunny Island, and Gwen and Jeff win the challenge. However, they wouldn't return the cursed statue since Beth's not here, so I think it's just a random statue that all teams are given, and they have to throw in the cave. I think Duncan and Cody do okay, but I think ultimately Justin and Lindsay will do terrible. Remembering the elimination order will now be Duncan and Cody, since the two can easily remember who won. Justin doesn't do that great since he doesn't really care, and I feel like Cody gets into an argument. Duncan makes fun of him, saying, "You don't even remember who got eliminated." Oh yeah, well I can remember Ezekiel, Noah, Trent, Katie, Tyler, Heather, Owen, Sadie, Courtney, Dakota, Eva. Well, would be Tyler, Izzy. Well, would be Ezekiel, Eva, Noah, Trent, Katie, Tyler, Izzy, Heather, Owen, Sadie, Courtney, Dakota, Eva, Harold, Izzy, Bridget, TJ, and Lashana. Am I missing anyone? Duncan would then realize that Cody's just named up the entire elimination order. He'd apologize, saying, "Sorry, little dude, I thought you were like Harold," meaning him and Cody both win immunity this episode. Now, everyone was worried it's a popularity contest at this point, and they'd be worried this is the case. So it's between Jeff and Justin, and it's clearly obvious that everyone votes for Justin in this episode, since Duncan has no reason in this version to betray Jeff, and they are still good friends. And in this timeline, Justin has used his looks to manipulate the girls, and they might think it's a popularity contest at this point, so they actually vote for Justin in this episode. So Justin is eliminated. In episode 22, let's get Jeff out of here since Lashana's not here to be the party animal. I think it would be between Lindsay and Jeff, but ultimately I think Jeff gets eliminated since he's the party animal and definitely the most liked out of the four of them. In episode 23 is a non-elimination round, but episode 24 will be guys versus girls. So Lindsay and Gwen versus Cody and Duncan. To be honest, Cody and Duncan don't have the map compass. I think this is pretty close, but I do give the win to Duncan and Cody. Chef will choose to vote for Lindsay since she did it worse in the boot camp episode. Now it's the I Triple Dog Dare You, and Gwen and Duncan will bring the worst out of each other. However, although Cody was quite resilient, I do think he would tag out before them since I don't think he'd be able to manage the pain very well. So I think Cody gets voted off here. The finale is Duncan and Gwen, and Dakota would actually support Gwen, and Duncan wouldn't be very liked, so I think it's actually the opposite that would happen. Most people support Gwen, with very little people supporting Duncan. Eva supports Gwen. The people supporting Gwen, I think, are probably Duncan are probably someone like Justin, Courtney, and Owen. That's kind of it. And to be honest, Heather would actually respect Justin for her play, getting rid of him. Gwen or Duncan would sacrifice the prize money since they were really a lot more competent and professionally able than Owen was. So this is the elimination order and the complete timeline to Old Rum Island, and now we get into revenge. So, first of all, because I don't think the order's going to arrive, Beth is just replacing Dakota, and she is going to be on the Rats team. She'd get along with everyone on her team, to be honest, but nothing important. The Rats would still lose due to bad luck, and Scott would still get everyone still votes for Stacy since Beth has no reason not to get voted off here. Episode 2 will actually be a difference because Scott starts throwing here and starts slowing down about 15 seconds. However, Beth will do decent, but not enough to win the challenge. Scott would get one to target Sam since he did terrible in this challenge and he got brutalized. On top of the fact, Scott could just convince everyone to vote off Sam in this episode. So I think he's actually able to get everyone to vote off Sam since he'd have no real reason to suspect Beth is a threat yet. So Beth would start befriending Dawn and B. In episode 3's Ice Ice Baby, Dawn would start reading Beth's aura and said that she's a decent person. To be honest, B would actually still do his flag and strategy, and Scott would still sabotage him. Scott would still frame B, and I don't think Beth really affects that. Episode 4, Dawn and Beth would be traveling together in the girls' cabin, and they would actually start becoming friends. Lightning would think she's kind of weird, but he wouldn't really think much of her. Scott would think Beth is very easy to manipulate to keep on side, and to be honest, the scavenger hunt, Dawn gets thrown in the tree like cannon and taken by lightning. Lightning then gets taken by the spider with Scott and Beth traveling together. To be honest, in this episode, nothing really changes with Joe still getting Brick to go sacrifice himself, and Brick still volunteered himself as tribute, and because of that, he is swapping to the Rats. Now, in episode 5 is where we have the Backstabbers Ahoy. Dawn starts suspecting something about Scott, but just can't put his finger on it. I think, to be honest, Beth would easily get along with Dawn and think she's great. Scott would still be sabotaging his team and overhear about Dawn, so he'd actually still throw. Scott would still steal the items to frame Dawn, and to be honest, everyone still votes her off. In episode 6, Nothing will in Runaway Model. Beth will have some ideas on fashion, but she ultimately won't be able to affect the challenge. Now that Sam will be here, there's no reason for the maggots to still win, since I think Beth doesn't really do that well affect much being on her team. Instead, Scott will convince everyone to vote for Brick since he did terrible in the challenge. On top of the fact, Scott can just instantly convince Lightning that Brick was the reason they lost the challenge, throwing a bunch of throwing stuff on graffiti on Brick. However, Beth would start figuring out there's something up about Scott, so he's able to convince Lightning, but is unable to convince. With Brick actually voting for Lightning, Beth would agree since she'd have no reason not to go with this vote. So I think she'd actually start rebelling against Scott here. And because Brick was on there, would point out that Brick's the new guy, so he'd want to target Brick for being a goody two shoes. So he gets everyone to vote for Brick, with Brick being voted off. Scott and Joe swap teams since I see no reason for this event not to play out the same, so Brick is eliminated. In episode 7, Beth is traveling with Joe and Lightning, and Joe's bossing around Beth and Lightning. Beth would actually start rebelling against Joe and realizing that Joe is very bossy and wouldn't really like her. However, she ultimately listens, and she listens to Heather in season 1. I think ultimately Scott still throws the challenge, and Maria gets kidnapped. The Rats win the challenge, since Brick's never here to sacrifice himself. To be honest, and Maria quits the competition, so it doesn't matter who is going home. In episode 8, there is some differences. First of all, Dakota Zoe doesn't exist, so she never returns as a player. Joe and Lightning ultimately do terrible, and so does Beth. Scott throws a challenge, and because the Mags have to actually go around the bush, they lose. So I think Beth doesn't really affect much of this challenge. And so the Rats win the challenge. And Mike and Cameron would vote for Scott. However, Scott would also show Zoe in good faith the idol, and they'd vote for Scott. But Scott still is the media idol, meaning that only his vote's the only one that counts. And he would choose to vote for Cameron, since of the two, Zoe would rather keep Mike over Cameron. However, he'd still want to keep Mike from blackmailing him in the next episode. So now we're at the merge, and basically Beth is here instead of Cameron. Joe and Lightning still make an alliance. Scott would still try to manipulate Beth to his side. He sabotages Mike, and Mike wants to tell Zoe about his personalities. And because Scott can't blackmail him for something he's not keeping a secret, he's getting voted off here. Episode 10, Joe still believes would make high balloon. However, Beth gets what Cameron got in the original, which doesn't change. Ultimately, Joe wins immunity since without Cameron to sabotage her, there's no reason for her to lose, meaning they go to elimination. Zoe votes for Scott and tries to convince Beth, with Joe voting for Lightning. Scott wants to keep Lightning, so he convinces Lightning to vote for Zoe, and Beth actually is convinced by Zoe, and Zoe explains the thought of Scott and starts to realize Scott isn't who he said he is, and he probably set up B and helped him get rid of B in episode 6. So I do think out of the two, these two vote for Lightning. Scott and Lightning vote for Zoe, and Beth would actually vote for Zoe, since Lightning was her former teammate, on top of the fact she doesn't really know Zoe, so I think she does get rid of Zoe in this episode. In episode 11 is the E challenge. Scott still sabotages everyone, and Beth finally sees this and confirms that Scott was using her. To be honest, in this episode, Lightning and Joe race to the pole, and Lightning wins immunity. Lightning votes for Joe. I think Beth votes for Scott, and Joe votes off Scott. So these two vote Scott, Lightning votes for Joe, and Scott votes for Joe. Since he thinks he has Beth on his side, which is a pretty shocking reveal that he actually doesn't. But Joe and Scott have to face a tiebreaker. I think whatever the tiebreaker was, I'm pretty sure Joe could beat Scott just by any tiebreaker. So I do think Scott gets eliminated in this episode. In episode 12, so they have to get the flags. I think Joe nor Lightning wouldn't team up with Beth, so she would just be traveling on her own. Lightning would still win the challenge because he gets the flower and would be more determined to win. Obviously, it's between Beth and Joe, and Lightning would choose to take Joe than Beth, since even though Joe is a bigger threat, he'd want to prove that he can beat Joe and be superior to her, since like Cameron, he'd be pissed at what for her betraying him and would want to crush her in the finale. Joe and Lightning both have to fight each other. However, Joe figures out pretty fast she can't actually face Lightning in hand-to-hand, and Cameron is forced to make a robot suit for her. Brick would support Lightning, but then gain the respect for Joe, and they each get alternate endings. And that's it for this video, and for What If Beth and Dakota was the different seasons. As you can see, Beth would have probably made it pretty far and got carried there, by honest, because of Scott. But I do kind of like the downfall that Beth lost to Scott. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Thank you guys for watching. This is the information I'm going to go on. If Beth and Dakota swap seasons. And yeah, peace and farewell.